Welcome beyond the text by 6-7. Art, I want you to picture the entire history of human belief as a battlefield. But it's not just armies clashing, it's a war of ideas. On one side, you have the divine, the concept of a personal creator God. On the other side, you have the godless systems that try to explain the universe without him, or by fracturing him into a million pieces. Today, we are diving into a massive, dusty, but absolutely electric book from 1883 called Error's Chains: How Forged and Broken.
What a title. It really sets the stakes, doesn't it?
It does. And here is the hook, the thing that flips your high school history class upside down. We usually think humanity started in ignorance, cavemen, grunts, worshiping rocks, and slowly evolved to find God. This book says, no, absolutely not. The central premise here is that humanity didn't start at the bottom, we started at the top. We started with the truth pure of monotheism, and the history of religion is actually the tragic story of how we degenerated, how we fell down the ladder into the worship of millions of idols, nature spirits, and eventually the cold logic of atheism.
It is a history of the world told as a tragedy, really. A story of a lost golden age of purity versus the accumulated chains of superstition. And we have to remember, this is 1883.
Right, context is king here.
Think about what is happening in the late 19th century. Charles Darwin has published On the Origin of Species. The intellectual world is, well, it's on fire with the idea of evolution, that everything moves from simple to complex, from amoeba to man, from superstition to science.
So the prevailing mood is, we're getting better.
Yeah.
We're on an upward trajectory.
Exactly. And here comes Frank S. Dobbins, our author, standing athwart history yelling, "Stop!" He is arguing the exact opposite of the Darwinian view, at least when it comes to religion. He's saying, no, we aren't evolving toward God. We devolved away from him. He views all the world's religions not as steps on a ladder up, but as debris from a fall down.
So our mission today is to walk through this crime scene. We're going to trace the shattering of the one God concept. We'll see how it broke into the many gods of the ancient world, how it spiraled into the no-God philosophy of Buddhism, and how the world has been trying to put the pieces back together ever since.
It's a detective story where the victim is truth and the suspects are, well, the entire human race.
Let's start at the beginning then, or as Dobbins calls it, the primitive unity.
This is the foundation of his whole argument. Dobbins argues that man began as a full-formed, mature, intelligent creature. He explicitly rejects the idea of the savage ancestor.
So no grunting at lightning, no hitting each other with clubs over a piece of meat.
Not in his view. He leans heavily on the old record, which is his term for the book of Genesis. But he knows his audience might be skeptical of that. So he tries to back it up with the hard science of his day. Philology, study of languages.
Which was the big tech of the 1880s, right? The DNA sequencing of its time.
It really was. He looks at the Indo-European language families, Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, German, and he sees they all share root words, words for father, mother, God. He argues that if the languages all spring from a common source, and this mirrors the Tower of Babel narrative, of course, then the ideas held by those original speakers must also come from a common source.
Okay, so that's the linguistic argument. But he doesn't just stop at words, he goes into folklore. And this is where the book went from interesting history to mind-blowing for me. He brings up the master thief.
This is a fantastic piece of comparative mythology. It's really the centerpiece of his fossil evidence argument.
So Dobbins starts pointing out these specific, almost oddly technical story structures that appear all over the world. Take the Norse tale. You've got this apprentice thief who wants to prove himself to the master. The master says, okay, steal that farmer's ox, but you can't hurt the farmer.
It's a test of wits, not just violence.
Exactly. So the thief goes to the road where the farmer's walking his ox. He takes a nice shoe, a boot with a silver buckle, and he drops it in the middle of the road. Then he hides in the bushes. The farmer comes along, sees the boot, picks it up, he looks at it and says, that's a fine boot, but it's only one. Useless. He throws it down and keeps walking.
So the trap fails, or seems to.
But the thief is fast. He runs through the woods, gets about a mile ahead of the farmer, and drops the other boot in the road.
Ah, the setup, the psychological play.
The farmer gets to the second spot. He sees the second boot. He stops dead. He thinks, darn it, if I had that first boot, I'd have a pair. So what does he do? He ties his ox to a tree and runs back a mile to get the first boot.
And the thief, of course, just steps out of the bushes, unties the ox, and walks away whistling.
Classic misdirection. It feels like a scene from a modern heist movie. But then Dobbins pulls out Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who was writing thousands of years ago about Egypt, And Herodotus tells a story about the sons of the king's architect robbing the treasury.
And this version is a bit grimmer. A lot grimmer, actually.
A little bit, yeah. One brother gets caught in a trap inside the treasury. He knows he can't get out. So he tells his brother, cut off my head and take it with you so they can't identify who I am and arrest our family.
Which is intense. But it creates this headless body mystery for the king.
Yeah, exactly. But the tricks the surviving brother uses later to fool the guards and steal the body back. They rely on the same kind of psychological misdirection as the Norse shoe trick. And then you find the shifty lad in Scotland, the poor mason in Spain, and similar trickster figures in Hindu folklore.
And Dobbins' argument here is crucial. He asks, is it likely that all these disparate cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently invented the exact same drop-the-shoe trick?
It seems highly unlikely.
Is it likely they copied each other in an era before mass communication? Also very unlikely. So the only conclusion left for him is that the story is older than the nations themselves. It's a fossil. It dates back to when the human family was one unit, sitting around the same campfire.
And here is the kicker. If they remember the story of the thief from before the scattering,
then they must also remember the god they worshipped before the scattering. Dobbins argues these myths are proof that we started together, with one culture and one truth.
so we have this primitive unity. We have monotheism. We are good. How do we lose it? How do we go from one God to the chaos we see later in history?
Dobbins calls it the first step down, and he identifies the culprit as nature worship.
Now, surely this wasn't an overnight thing. You don't just wake up one Tuesday and decide the sun is your boss.
No, it was gradual. And Dobbins is actually very empathetic here. He describes the psychology of early man. Imagine you are a herdsman. You live under the open sky, you see the sun, it gives warmth, it grows your crops. But it can also scorch you. You see the storm, it brings water, but it can destroy your tent.
You feel awe and maybe a little bit of terror.
You feel awe, and Dobbins says that awe is natural, it's correct. But then a shift happens. The human mind starts to attribute passions to these elements.
You start personifying them. You give them a personality.
Exactly. A clear sky isn't just high pressure. It's the sky being peaceful. A thunderstorm isn't just electricity. It's the sky being angry.
And specifically angry at you.
That is the moment. The moment you decide the storm has a personality and intentions toward you, you have crossed the bridge. You have shifted from worshiping the creator of the storm to worshiping the created storm itself.
That is the transition period.
Yeah.
That's the first link in the chain of error.
And once you cross that bridge, the floodgates open. Because nature is diverse. If the sun is a person and the moon is a person and the river is a person, suddenly you don't have one god, you have a pantheon. You have polytheism.
Which leads us directly into what the source calls the dead religions, the ones that had their time in the sun and then vanished. Let's talk about Egypt, the land of the Sphinx.
Egypt is the perfect example of this complexity. To the outsider, it looks like obsessed idolatry. You have animal worship crocodiles, cats, bulls, beetles.
To a 19th century scholar, that must have looked insane. Civilized people, people who built the pyramids, bowing to a cat.
It looked like degeneration incarnate. But Dobbins, to his credit, digs deeper. He acknowledges the Book of the Dead and the obsession with mummies and the afterlife, but he finds something profound in the negative confession.
This is the scene in the afterlife courtroom, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Hall of Two Truths. The soul stands before 42 judges.
42 judges. That is a tough crowd. No wonder they were so obsessed with getting it right.
And the soul has to justify itself. But listen to the moral standard here. It doesn't just say, I sacrificed the right goat. The soul says things like, I have not stolen, I have not slain men, I have not made unjust commandments.
And my favorite line from the text, I have not withheld milk from sucklings.
It is incredibly specific and compassionate. I have not turned away the water in its season. That's about irrigation rights, about community welfare. Dobbins points this out to show that the conscience, the moral law he believes was implanted by the one God, was still active, even under all these layers of animal worship.
But then he reveals the secret of Egypt, the difference between what the priests believed and what the people were told to believe.
This is what he calls the hidden monotheism. Dobbins argues that the priests, the initiated elite, knew better. They knew the cat wasn't God. They knew the statue of Osiris was just stone. They secretly held on to a pantheistic unity, a belief in a God world, a single life force running through everything.
But they didn't think the common peasant could handle that level of abstraction.
No. They believed the masses needed toys. They needed visible symbols. So the priests kept the truth for themselves and gave the people the idols.
It's the ultimate noble lie. Here, worship this beetle, leave the metaphysics to us.
And Dobbins sees this as a fatal error. A religion where the leaders believe one thing and the followers believe another is built on a lie. It's hollow at its core, and eventually it will collapse.
Now, if Egypt was dignified and complex in its era, Babylon was just a mess.
Chuckles. Dobbins has very little patience for Assyria and Babylon.
He describes the worship there as materialistic and obscene. And we have to talk about the fish god.
The Winians. Yeah, it's a strange one.
Describe this nightmare. I mean, what even is that?
It's often depicted as a figure with the body of a fish, but a human head, or sometimes a man wearing a giant fish like a cloak with the fish head as a hat. Sometimes it has an eagle's tail. It's a chimera, a monster. It's confusion made manifest.
And the sheer volume of gods. Egypt had a lot, but Babylon went completely overboard.
The text mentions that in some traditions, they counted 65,000 gods.
65,000. I can't even remember my Wi-Fi password. How do you remember 65,000 gods? What do? Carry a spreadsheet.
You don't. And that is the point Dobbins makes. This creates a psychology of terror. If there are 65,000 gods, you are definitely offending one of them right now. You just stepped on a twig. That twig was holy to the god of twigs. You swatted a fly. That was the god of insects' cousin.
You are living in a spiritual minefield. Every action could have divine consequences.
Exactly. And Dobbins contrasts this sharply with the Hebrews living right next door. You have this tiny nation Israel worshiping one God with the clear moral code, surrounded by a massive empire trembling before 65,000 demons and chimeras. It highlights the uniqueness of the monotheistic claim in the ancient world.
So those civilizations collapsed.
Mm.
Their gods are in museums. But the chain of error didn't stop there. It kept forging new links. And that brings us to the living religions, the ones that took this fragmentation to the absolute limit. We have to talk about Hinduism.
If Babylon was a fracture, Hinduism is a kaleidoscope. In the text, it represents the ultimate scattering of the divine, the logical endpoint of polytheism.
We went from 65,000 gods in Babylon to, what is the number Dobbins cites?
330 million.
330 million. That is roughly the population of the United States. Imagine a god for every single person in America. It's incomprehensible.
It represents the idea that God isn't everything, but in a way that dilutes the concept of God until it's almost meaningless. Dobbins traces this from the early Vedas, where it was simpler nature worship, Agni the fire god, Indra the storm god, to this massive, all-absorbing system.
But Dobbins is a storyteller, and he tells this fantastic myth called the Sage's Search to explain how the Hindus viewed their own gods. And honestly, it makes the gods seem so human and petty.
It's a very telling myth. It reveals a lot about the character of the deities.
So set the scene. You have a group of sages sitting by a river having a theological debate. Who is the greatest god? Is Brahma the creator, Shiva the destroyer, or Vishnu the preserver?
A classic divine power struggle.
They can't decide. So they send a sage named Brigu to test them. Brigu goes to Brahma first. He walks into Brahma's court. And remember, Brahma is the creator of the universe, and Brigu just ignores him, doesn't bow, doesn't say hello, just walks past.
A massive insult in that kind of hierarchical divine culture.
And Brahma loses it. He turns red, he swells with rage, he's about to blast Brigu into cosmic dust. But he holds it back, barely.
So Brigu marks him down in his mental notebook, ruled by pride.
Next, he goes to Shiva. Shiva's the destroyer, sitting there, maybe meditating, maybe just hanging out with his wife. Brigu walks up and disrespects him openly.
And Shiva, being the destroyer, grabs his trident. He is ready to kill. His wife has to physically hold him back.
So Brigu marks him down, ruled by anger.
He's proving these gods are just superpowered humans with very human flaws.
But then he goes to Vishnu, the preserver. He finds Vishnu fast asleep, and Brigu decides to really push the envelope. He walks up to the sleeping god and kicks him in the chest.
A death sentence, surely. If you don't kick a god.
You would think. But Vishnu wakes up with a start. He sees the sage. And instead of grabbing a lightning bolt, Vishnu starts gently massaging the sage's foot.
And he says what?
He says, "Oh, honorable sage, I am so sorry. My chest is as hard as a diamond, and your foot is as soft as a lotus flower. I hope I didn't hurt your foot."
And the result of the contest.
Vishnu is voted supreme. Not because he's the strongest or the most powerful, but because he kept his cool. He showed humility.
It is a funny story, and it shows the charm and, the psychological depth of the mythology. But Dobbins doesn't stay in the funny zone. He pivots to the darker side of this fragmentation.
Yeah, the text gets pretty heavy here. We have to talk about Kali.
The goddess of blood. Dobbins is writing this when the British Empire is actively wrestling with the thugs, the Thuggee cult.
The Stranglers.
Yeah.
I've read about that. It's horrifying.
Right. These were bands of men who believed that murdering and robbing travelers was a religious act, a form of worship devoted to Kali. Dobbins uses this to make a severe point. When you disconnect religion from the one true God, who is defined by justice and order, you don't just get silly stories about kicking gods. You can get morality completely inverted. You get murder as worship.
And then there is the caste system. Dobbins calls this the atheism of caste, which sounds like a contradiction. How can a religion with 330 million gods be atheistic?
This is a crucial insight of his. He means it is atheistic in its operation. It functions like a cold, merciless machine. If you are born a Sudra, a servant, you are a Sudra. There is no grace. There is no father you can pray to who will say, it doesn't matter what your job is, I love you, you are my child. The system is rigid steel. It extinguishes brotherhood.
It's a religious structure, but it lacks the heart of religion, which he would define as that personal relationship. And that lack of hope ties directly into the concept of the soul, transmigration.
The soul passing through 8,400,000 births.
That is just an exhausting number to even contemplate.
It creates a sense of cosmic weariness, and the text highlights a logic loop regarding sacrifices that Dobbins finds particularly absurd and telling.
Oh, this part. The degeneration of the sacrifice. Explain that.
Yes, the Hindu texts say that in the beginning, the gods killed a man-god as the ultimate sacrifice. But the sacrificial essence, the holiness, left the man and went into a horse. So the horse became the new proper thing for sacrifice.
Okay, so far so good.
But then they killed the horse, the essence went into an ox. They killed the ox, it went into a sheep, then a goat.
And finally, where does it end up?
In the earth, in the dirt. Dobbins sees this as a perfect metaphor for the whole system. Degeneration. The holy thing keeps moving down, from man to beast to dirt.
Whereas the monotheistic view is all about elevation, lifting man up toward God.
Precisely. So you have this system of despair, endless rebirth, caste oppression, 330 million capricious gods. Dobbins argues that the human spirit can only take so much of that before it breaks, or before it rebels.
And that rebellion brings us to the pivot point of the episode.
Yeah.
If Hinduism is too many gods, the next link in the chain is no God. We are talking about Buddhism.
The atheistic turn, the great reaction.
Now, Dobbins is a Christian missionary scholar. I expected him to tear Buddha apart. But he actually speaks about Gautama Buddha with a surprising amount of respect.
He does. He calls him the light of Asia. He acknowledges his compassion. He retells the story of the four visions, where the young Prince Gautama sees an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a wandering ascetic. Dobbins sees Buddha as a man who was honestly and profoundly heartbroken by the suffering of the world.
He validates the problem Buddha saw. He gets why he was so moved.
Yeah.
But he absolutely hates the solution he came up with.
Because, according to Dobbins and the sources he's using, Buddhism is metaphysical atheism.
Wait, unpack that for us. Because we see Buddha statues everywhere. It looks like a religion. People pray to it.
Looks like one now, yes. But Dobbins argues that Buddha's original teaching had no God, no creator, no judge, no divine being to appeal to.
Just cause and effect, karma, an impersonal cosmic law.
Exactly. Buddha taught self-salvation. The famous phrase is, be ye lamps unto yourselves. To a 19th century monotheist, this is the ultimate divergence. It is man firing God and saying, don't worry, I'll handle this myself.
And the goal isn't heaven. It's not eternal life with a loving God. It's nirvana.
Which Dobbins translates, based on his reading of the scholarship of the time, as extinction, the blowing out of the candle of consciousness.
So in Hinduism, you live forever, and it's a terrible grind. In Buddhism, the prize for winning the game is you cease to exist.
That's how Dobbins interprets it. He views it as a philosophy of, well, a sort of cosmic suicide, a noble, gentle suicide, perhaps, but a negation of existence. He argues that the human heart cannot actually live on that. We crave life. We crave a person to love, not a void to vanish into.
And history seems to back him up on this point, because look at the irony.
Mm-hmm.
Buddha said, no idols. He said, I am just a teacher. And what happened almost immediately?
The world became full of Buddha idols,
Okay.
millions of them.
The text mentions the tooth of Buddha in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka.
A piece of ivory the size of a man's arm.
Which, I mean, unless Buddha was a giant with hippo teeth, that is not a human tooth.
It emphasizes the desperation of the human spirit to have something to worship. Dobbins argues that man must worship. You can take away God. You can teach a high-minded philosophy about the extinction of desire. But eventually, people will start worshiping a piece of ivory.
Or the white elephant.
Yeah.
This story was incredible.
Oh, the white elephant in Siam, which is modern-day Thailand.
The king of Siam gave the author's friend hairs from the tail of the white elephant, and he gave it as a gift more precious than gold.
Imagine getting that for your birthday. Here are some tail hairs from a special elephant.
Less, but to them, it was divine. It was a relic.
It proves Dobbins' central thesis, atheism, even a noble philosophical atheism like Buddhism, cannot satisfy the human heart. The heart creates idols to fill the void that God left behind.
And speaking of filling the void with mechanics, we have to mention the prayer wheels of Tibet.
The mechanical side of godless religion. Yeah. This really fascinated him.
You write a prayer on a piece of paper, put it in a wheel, give it a spin, and boom, prayer said. Or you can have a watermill do it for you.
The famous mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum.
Dobbins seems pretty unimpressed by this. He finds it almost insulting.
He views it as the hollow shell of religion. If there's no personal God to hear the prayer, then the prayer becomes just motion. It's just physics. Rotating wheels, flags flapping in the wind, water mills turning the prayers for you. It is outward motion without any inward connection or relationship.
So we have had many gods in Hinduism, no God in Buddhism, and now the pendulum swings back with incredible force. We have to talk about God without fatherhood, Islam.
Islam poses a unique challenge for Dobbins' categorization. It breaks his neat pattern.
Right, because he can't call them idolaters. They are the opposite of idolaters.
Exactly. Muhammad was the ultimate iconoclast, the camel driver who rode into Mecca and broke the idols.
There is no God but God. You can't get more monotheistic than that. It's the central claim.
Precisely. But Dobbins still labels it a false religion. And this is where it gets very nuanced. He admits Islam hates idols, he admits it holds to the truth of the unity of God, but he critiques the nature of that God.
Before we get to the critique, we have to tell a dervish story. This is one of the smartest, funniest moments in the text.
It is a very clever bit of Sufi wisdom, yeah.
So a skeptic comes to a dervish, a Muslim holy man, and he asks 3 questions. He said, I will believe if you can answer these. First, show me God. If I can't see him, he doesn't exist.
Pure empiricism. Show me the data.
Second, the Quran says Satan is made of fire, and hell is made of fire. How can fire hurt fire? Doesn't make logical sense.
The good old-fashioned logical puzzle.
And third, if fate rules everything, if God has written our destiny, why am I responsible for my actions? God made me do it.
The classic free will versus determinism debate. These are not easy questions.
So the dervish listens patiently. He nods. And then, without saying a single word, he bends down, picks up a huge hard clod of dirt, and hurls it right into the skeptic's face. Smack.
The direct approach, a very physical form of debate.
The guy is furious, his nose is bleeding, his face is cut. He drags the dervish to the local judge. The judge asks the dervish to explain himself, and the dervish says,
He says, Your Honor, that clod of dirt was the answer to all 3 of his questions.
Break it down. How does that work?
He says, first, the man claims he has pain in his face. Can he show me the pain? Can he hold it in his hand? No. But he feels it. So things can exist even if you can't see them.
Point 1 made. Nicely done.
Then he says, the man is made of earth. The clod is made of earth. How can earth hurt earth?
Point 2 made. Checkmate on that one.
And finally he says, he claims fate rules everything. So if I threw the clod, it was fate. It was God's will. Why is he blaming me?
Game, set, and match. It's brilliant.
It's a brilliant payoff. It shows the intellectual robustness of the tradition. But despite this wisdom, Dobbins argues that the God of Islam, Allah, is perceived as too distant, too remote.
He calls him a ruler, not a father.
That's the core distinction for Dobbins. He argues that while Islam returned to monotheism, it missed the relationship aspect, the intimacy. He claims it relies on the sword rather than persuasion for its spread. And he also argues it degrades progress and womanhood. So in his chain of errors, Islam is a huge step back towards the truth, but it stops short of the final destination.
So we've covered the big civilizations. But Dobbins doesn't ignore the rest of the world. He looks at what he calls the primitive remnants. He turns to Africa and the Americas.
And here he returns to his degeneration theory with full force. He looks at the fetish worship in Africa.
Now, a fetish isn't a god, right? The book explains it's different.
It's more like a spiritual battery. It's a stick, a stone, a skull. You charge it with worship or sacrifices, and in return it gives you power or protection. It's very transactional. But Dobbins points out the horror that can come from this. He describes the Juju house in Bonny, West Africa.
The Temple of Skulls. Just the name is chilling.
Yes. Walls literally built of human skulls. For Dobbins, it's the ultimate degradation of the image of God in man. It's what happens when the fall hits rock bottom. It's spirituality completely untethered from morality.
But then he looks at the Americas, at the Native Americans, and he sees something different. He sees the Great Spirit.
He views the Great Spirit as a lingering, faint echo of that original monotheism the human race started with. He doesn't see it as a new invention, but as a corrupted memory, a fossil of the truth.
He tells the story of the Alaskan Prometheus, a figure named Yel, who stole fire from mankind.
Again, connecting back to those universal myths like the Master Thief. He sees the Great Spirit as evidence that even in total isolation, humanity couldn't quite forget the one God they started with. The memory was just very faint.
So we have toured the world. We've seen the Golden Age, the fracture into nature worship, the explosion into millions of Hindu gods, the philosophical pivot to atheism, the fierce return of Islam, and the faint echoes in the Americas. Dobbins brings it all together in his conclusion.
He calls it the battlefield.
He loves his military metaphors, this author.
He does. It was a very martial age. He looks at the numbers: 500 million Buddhists, 327 million Christians. And remember, these are 1883 numbers. And he sees a war. He frames it as the Christian army versus the giant Goliath of heathenism.
And his conclusion is optimistic, right? For his side, anyway. He thinks the chain is being broken.
He argues that the world is moving back to its first worship. The circle is closing. From one god, it scattered to many gods and then no god. And now he believes it's on a trajectory back to one god. He believes that the sheer incoherence of polytheism and the despair of atheism are naturally pushing humanity back toward the fatherhood concept he finds uniquely in Christianity.
That is the aha moment of the book. The idea that history isn't a straight lineup, but a giant circle returning to the start.
Whether one accepts his specifically Christian conclusion or not, the structure of history he presents is fascinating. It completely challenges the modern idea of linear progress.
So what does this all mean for us sitting here today? What's the so what?
Well, Dobbins wrote this in 1883. He was confident idolatry was dying. He basically said, give it 50 years, maybe 100, and the idols will all be dust. But if we look at the world today...
The master thief is still leaving shoes in the road. The tricks are still being played.
Indeed. We might not be worshiping the fish god Owens anymore, not literally. But the psychological roots he described, the fear, the desire for control, the awe of power, those things haven't gone away.
That's the thing. We might not have idols of stone, but we might have idols of silicon. We attribute passions to the algorithm. We say the algorithm is punishing me today, or the algorithm blessed me.
That is a profound parallel. Dobbins showed us that when men stop worshiping God, they don't worship nothing, they worship anything.
A tooth, a white elephant, the stock market, a political ideology.
The chains Dobbins talks about, the chains of error might just be forged in different metals today. They might be less visible, but just as heavy.
That is a provocative thought to leave you with. Have we really broken the chains, or have we just given them a shiny new coat of digital paint?
A question worth pondering long after this is over.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into error's chains. It's been a wild ride from 1883 to the present. We'll see you next time.